Hello everyone and welcome back to You Have the Right to Remain Fat. Today we're looking at Chapter 8, What Early Fat Activism Taught Me. In 2010, I was introduced to fat activism while I was getting my master's degree in sexuality studies. I had been interviewing fat women about how their size had affected their development of their gender. At the time, the world of fat activism was small, news traveled fast, introductions were eagerly made, and there was an almost electric feeling to all of it. Even though fat feminism has roots in 1960s Jewish lesbian politics, this iteration of the fat movement was, in many ways, a campy and irreverent offshoot that was just beginning to gain traction. Everyone on the planet who was doing anything visible around fat politics knew everyone else. There were small pockets in the Bay Area, the Midwest, the Pacific Northwest, New York, Canada, the UK, and Australia. I would later meet fat activists in Mexico, Chile, Italy, Austria, and New Zealand. Through the fat grapevine, someone had found out that I was doing research on fatness, and all of a sudden, I was meeting fat activists. They introduced me to people they knew, they recommended books. The most memorable and impactful introduction came when someone asked, "Have you heard of the No Lose Conference?" I said no and asked her what it was. She said it was a conference for fat queers and that I had to go. So a few weeks later, I found myself taking a train and then a bus to a hotel in Oakland. I had no idea how significant stepping off that bus was going to be. I was a new kid in a new town, a mildly frumpy wallflower who was about to have her goddamn mind blown. I dragged my sad navy blue suitcase down the concrete, through the decorative rock garden, and onto the hotel property, pushing the glasses up the bridge of my nose all the while. I would just like to say I find it hard to believe that Virgie was ever a wallflower. Just from, even when she's just describing her childhood, she was like the loud, boisterous one. So what happened that made her go to the wallflower and then back to who she is now? Is it truly just a matter of shyness? Or, like, she doesn't really strike me as this type of person. I kind of feel like it's an editorialization to suit whatever narrative that she's trying to portray. I think what she's trying to get to, and we will see if I'm right as we go through, is that the fat acceptance group is exceptionally like an accepting, wonderful, heart-filled place, that they welcomed me, a mildly frumpy wallflower. Like, I kind of feel like she's changing who she is in this narrative to suit whatever claim she's trying to make. Granted, people are also fairly complex, and you can be very shy in one circumstance and very confident in another, so perhaps that's what it is. I don't know, but that was just the general feeling I got. As I was making my way through the breezeway, I heard the sound of splashing and women's laughter. I could smell the chlorine from the pool, and then I saw them. A group of fat babes. I had never seen fat women in a group like this. I had never seen fat women in cute bathing suits. I had never seen fat women in cute bathing suits lounging and floating and chatting in public. At a pool, no less. There were fatties floating in the water, lounging in chairs, getting a tan, complimenting other fatties about how good they looked, and reading poolside. I was frozen in place by the sight of them, unapologetically, blissfully living. I had never seen women like them, women like us, living without any discernible trace of shame. They were doing what I believed fat people could never do. And then from stage left came this high femme redhead. She was wearing a red vintage bathing suit with white polka dots and a huge pair of cat-eye sunglasses. Her large breasts, belly, and thighs were hardly contained. And trailing behind her was a boy holding a parasol over her so she wouldn't burn. I think she talked about this in that TED Talk that we saw, right? She had the glamour of a movie star and a body that wasn't so different from my own. And in that moment, I was converted. I gave myself over to the ultra-mega badass fat babe lifestyle when I saw her. In her, I saw the possibility of an entirely different life. It was like those transformation teen movies, but rather than my body changing, something else happened. I realized after years of dieting that I had been trying to change the wrong thing. I didn't need to change my body. I needed to change the way I felt about it. When I was introduced to fat activism, it was a uniquely and resoundingly queer political movement. Fat people and the needs of fat people were at the center of the politic. The movement had an anti-assimilation framework that I found both familiar and wonderfully proactive. We ruthlessly questioned notions like health and fitness and talked about the ways that fat people were threatening because we interrupted heteronormative timelines, though not often using that exact verbiage. Wait, what do you mean heteronormative? So, well, I guess she did say that according to her, it was a resoundingly queer political movement, this fat activism, which is kind of, it's not the first time that I've heard it, but it's the first time that I've seen the emphasis put on the queerness of it, because normally what they say is, what fat activists say is that it was founded by fat queer femmes. So I mean, queer was in there, or black queer femmes, I think was what it was. But there was always a more emphasis on the race, and yet she makes no comment on the race of these people that she sees here in the initial. It's one of those things where it's like, again, I can't remember. I want to say it was Funty Times, I think, that did the history of, it might have been Nadia Nymph, the history of fat activism, and found that it was actually a bunch of straight white men that wanted to stop getting picked on for their fetish, which was big women. And I think to give itself more legitimacy as it became more populated with women, the fat activist movement became more populated with women, they tried to legitimize it more by creating this narrative that it was founded by black queer femmes, completely erasing the white straight male origins, the roots of it. I don't know, it's interesting because this one makes no real comment on the race of these women. Not that it has to. I don't want to say that it has to, like, people of color have to be prevalent in every single piece in order for it to be legitimate, because even if people of color didn't make it to this conference, it doesn't mean that it's less legitimate. Well, it's fat activism, so it isn't really legitimate, but you guys know what I mean, right? You guys know what I mean. My point being that in this one, which I believe this book is like 10 years old, the focus was on queerness, which was kind of what was in vogue at the time, where this acceptance, the social movement of accepting gay people was, and homophobic was the big in vogue term. Her narrative suits this, but does not comment on people of color so much, which didn't come into social justice fashion until maybe about 5 years ago with the BLM movement, when the BLM movement gained a lot more traction. And since then, it's even ramped up more because of police brutality and other issues. I don't know. I think it's interesting how, for as much as the current fat activists tried to claim people of color as part of their movement, it wasn't as prevalent in this early time. Although Virgie is a person of color, so there is that, but it wasn't as centered as queerness was, which was what was the social, in vogue, social justice point of the time. It's an interesting note for me. Liberation was central to the conversations I was witnessing and participating in. There was a recognition that acceptance was not a desired outcome because absorption into the racist, patriarchal, and fatphobic culture that has systematically dehumanized you isn't exactly a win. Acceptance is kind of like marrying that dude in high school who called you a fat pig every day for 4 years and then ran into you 8 years later when you looked a lot cuter. Because when you weren't living under the reign of his emotional violence, you actually had the space to put together outfits you loved and get an amazing haircut. And then asks you to date him, and you say yes because you are so traumatized that you can only experience his violence as love, right? What in the fuck? What in the actual fuck? There's a couple of things to unpack here in this paragraph. One, you say that there was a recognition that acceptance was not a desired outcome, and yet there is the fat acceptance movement. There is like the fat acceptance movement, and a lot of what their talking points, a lot of like TikTok land talking points, and this could just, again, this was 10 years ago, so perhaps this is a natural progression of their movement, was that it became less about this racist and patriarchal culture. They still focus on the fat phobic part, but their way of fighting the patriarchy is saying, you're fat phobic if you don't find fat women attractive. And because fat phobia is rooted in racism, you're also racist. Like, they do this whole mental gymnastics thing to get there, as a way to, I think, justify their pursuit of acceptance. And then their whole thing with fighting the fat phobic culture, though, is saying, we don't have enough cute clothes. There's a few things with medical stuff, but the vast majority of stuff that I see is either them being able to eat donuts in public, which they can do anyway, or whether they have enough cute clothes available to them. As for this whole theoretical, this is a very specific theoretical situation. I'm just going to read this part again real quick. Acceptance is kind of like marrying that dude in high school who called you a fat pig every day for 4 years and then ran into you 8 years later when you were looking a lot cuter. Because when you weren't living under his reign of emotional violence, so now we know where the violence against fat people comes from. They equate, because here's the thing, I don't really like saying something is violence that isn't physically violent, because I feel like it detracts from how heavy that is and how serious physical violence is. I don't necessarily, for some reason, violence to me has more impact than abuse, than the word abuse, because abuse is this like prevailing thing, so it's easier to see how something can be emotionally abusive because it is this ongoing issue. It's this ongoing pattern of behavior that causes harm, and that's a lot easier to equate with emotionality and psychological issues than the word violence. I don't really like the word emotional violence because I just feel like it detracts from huge issue that is someone saying punching you in the face. Like, someone calling you names isn't cool, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that that's an okay thing, but I think that there's a big difference between someone calling you names and someone punching you in the face. One is very violent. One causes serious physical harm. Calling you names can cause emotional harm, and I'm not saying that it's something that should be excusable or anything. I just think that there's something worth preserving in that word of violence, strictly for physical issues. There actually are a couple of instances where emotional violence is kind of warranted, but again, it tends to also fall into abuse. I don't know. I don't really know what I'm trying to get at, but I just have a hard time with saying that this guy that called you a fat pig every day, he was definitely abusive. I struggle with the term emotional violence. I just do. Because you weren't living under the reign of his emotional violence, you actually had space to put together outfits you loved and get an amazing haircut. And this, again, I think actually detracts from their overall argument, because she says the net benefit of not being around this person that called her a fat pig every day, the net benefit, the big benefit she got was that she was able to put together cute outfits and get a haircut, rather than saying, you weren't beaten down so much, you weren't enduring the abuse so much, that you were able to hold your head up high and that you had more confidence. And I think that might be implicitly meant here, but this is a common thing with the fat activist movement, where they focus on the outward abilities. They say, they use a term like emotional violence, which is meant to equate emotional abuse with physical violence. And I might even be able to get on board with that if the next sentence wasn't about them being able to put together cute outfits put together outfits you love and get an amazing haircut. If someone was hurling physical violence at you every day, one of the net benefits would be that you don't have bruises, you don't have broken bones, you aren't sore every day and cowering in fear and so preoccupied with that you can actually function and focus. That argument could be meant for this term emotional violence too, if you want to get into, you weren't second guessing yourself constantly, you weren't constantly analyzing how this particular outfit would be perceived on your body. Like there's some ways of phrasing that where the emotional violence words could actually be driven home better. I think maybe the issue that I have with the term emotional violence is the context of the benefit of not having this so-called emotional violence is that you put together outfits you love and get an amazing haircut, rather than you're not living in fear of judgment or something like that. It's the way that they use these very loaded terms and say the benefit of not having these loaded terms in their lives is something kind of frivolous. And it's not that, being confident is frivolous. It's just that they're not even talking about confidence here. They're talking about outfits you love and a haircut, which I guess can be an allegory for confidence, but it's still just something where there seems to be a focus on a superficial benefit. As fat activism began to be eclipsed by body positivity, there was a shift away from the liberation framework in favor of assimilation. I think I can say as lovingly as possible that body positivity has gained and will continue to gain traction with its newfound focus. As a straight, cisgender woman, I honestly understand the deep and hypnotic draw of assimilation. The closer you perceive your access to ideal citizenship to be, the harder it is to wanting something bigger, better. But fat activism taught me that being accepted by the very people who made me feel less than human isn't enough, so why settle? Over the years, I began to find myself in more and more body-positive spaces and fewer fat activism spaces. My drift toward body positivity spaces felt unintentional, but I know it was facilitated by a number of things. My straightness, my access to higher education, and my ability to code switch into white spaces. My access to and interest in publishing, my sunshiny disposition, my desire and ability to monetize my work, and my size and shape relative to other fat people. I feel a lot of ambivalence about all of this, but the point of the story is that this transition was honestly startling in a number of key ways. So I don't think that... Here's the thing. I'm not saying that assimilation is always the best option, but I don't think that it's wrong to aim for a level of assimilation into the general culture. But also, I think that there's a mistake in forcing people to accept everything, accept your entire behavior, expect it as normal and as for lack of a better term, valid than the ideal citizenship that people tend to think in their minds. I'm not saying that you can't fight for that, but then, here's the thing. We all kind of create that in our minds. I certainly feel pressure. This is a little off, but it's the best I have at the moment. Actually, it's not too far off. It's coming from someone from an eighth arrow perspective. So I have no desire to have kids. I have no desire to have a partner. I'm very happy on my own with my crafts, pets, and plants. I'm happy that way. But given that I work in a very life scripty career path of teaching, I do get a lot of questions of, so when are you going to have kids? Do you have a partner? Oh, let me set you up. Oh, why no boyfriend? Why... you're getting older, you're blah, 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 blah. And, I don't really care. And so there is that pressure of assimilation into the general life script as it would better blend in with my current career path. That being said, I have enough confidence in myself to go, that will not make me happy. Actually, there was an older family member that I haven't talked to in a long time, but apparently mentioned to another family member who told me that they think I need a man in my life and need to start having kids. Their opinion means nothing to me, so I paid it no mind. But that's just a common thing. And so an assimilation would be for me to follow that life script. I don't have to follow that life script if I don't want to, just as they don't have to follow the assimilation, the script of what they refer to as a good fatty. You don't have to do it, but you also don't, the answer isn't to try to force people to accept you, because if I went around saying, I don't need kids to be happy, how dare you say that to me? How dare you think that I need a man and kids to make me happy? I'm my own woman, I can do this. Like, if I made this that whole fight, I come across as far more unhinged. You kind of have to pick and choose. Like, there's a clear boundary that I have where if someone actively was trying to set me up with someone, I would be like, that's enough, stop. It's not okay, because at that point they're trespassing on my individuality. They're trespassing on what I choose to do with my time and how I choose to live my life. But if they're just making comments and they're just asking about it, one, I just don't think they understand, given that I understand that my way of living isn't common, especially in my line of work. And it's fine. It's not that big of a deal. As long as they don't push it, I don't care. So, to a certain extent, I think that the fat activist space, and in that way, because I don't push it and I just allow them to either assume, I think a lot of them do assume that I have a boyfriend and I don't, or a fiance or something that I just don't talk about, and I let them, and in that way I assimilate, because it's not worth the fight. Like, it means nothing. It's none of their fucking business anyway. Just as it's no one else's business if you're fat, so stop trying to make it everyone's business. That's the thing, is that, yes, assimilate in the, I'm working on it, and you can fucking lie. You don't owe anyone the truth of how you truly feel. You don't owe anyone the reality of your life. Besides, to a degree, and you can see this on social media, we all live in our myths anyway. Live in your myth, girl, and play the part in reality. It's not, I understand that this isn't completely advisable, and it's not always possible depending on where you live and how outwardly your identity is manifested. I tend to wear a lot of florals and tend to have a very average appearance, so it's very easy for me to just kind of hide in the shadows a little bit. For someone who is genuinely marginalized, someone who is very outwardly coded as queer, or even those of a different race who, it's not like they can hide their race, and if they're surrounded by a bunch of racists, it's not like they can hide. So there's definitely that part too, but I think fat activism is something you have to draw attention to and make yourself seen. So I don't know, I'm rambling. I might cut a portion of this out. First, within the body positivity movement, the demands were much more difficult to decipher. I was pretty sure that liberation was not a demand, but I wasn't sure what was. Equality? Cute dates? I quickly discovered that it was no accident that I had no idea what the demands were. It was through silence that this body positive movement spoke most clearly and loudly to mainstream culture. The rules of femininity state that it is not ladylike to make demands or set boundaries. In many ways, that is why feminists are often masculinized and consequently demonized. I will meet you halfway and say that I think that some people that do set boundaries and genuinely just try to live their life are masculinized as a way to bring them down, and it's not right. There are also a number of feminists, and I say feminists in quotes, that also just speak out about how they hate men and are very aggressive, which is what we equate, very a masculine trait. So in that way, they kind of masculinize themselves. That's a 50-50 one for me. So the women-led body positivity movement's choice to make no clear demands is about the willingness to sacrifice rights and freedom for the maintenance of the oppressive construct. Trying to decipher the silence reminded me of the lessons my grandma used to give me about dealing with men. Silence was a very powerful tool. Silence, according to my grandmother, was the appropriate response to verbal abuse or sexual dissatisfaction, even coercion. Silence was the antidote to a fight. You got a man to pay for your meal not by asking, but by not asking. I learned to excuse myself at the end of the date so he wouldn't be left with the untidy conversation around payment and the power dynamics that live at the core of that conversation. Silence is a very gendered and highly racialized tactic. To a degree, I would say that it is gendered and racialized. I do agree with that to an extent. I also think that a missing variable here is the people who are often silent are also often socially insecure, like they're a little socially awkward, they don't have confidence in themselves. So in that way, that's also the issue. They don't want to rock the boat, and that tends to skew definitely more female, I think. I can't really comment on the racial part of that because I genuinely don't know. But I think that there's also a variable in there of just personality type that tends to be a little bit more meek, which can definitely be gendered towards women. It can also just be a personality trait. I don't know. It was the silence in the body positivity movement that allowed traction to be gained. If there's nothing clearly articulated, then there's nothing to violate. No need to call anyone out if there's nothing to call out. Second, there was less a desire for freedom than for absorption. I began to notice that there was a real preoccupation with prescriptive gender behavior. After years of being around women who pushed back against the oppressive Susie Sunshine archetype, I was starting to feel a real sense that these women didn't want to be impolite, didn't want to raise their voices, and wanted to make political strides through hugs and genteel working lunches. It was white femininity if I ever saw it. And even though it was never said out loud, their behavior indicated a commitment to the status quo that was staggering to me, especially after having spent nearly a decade in queer feminist spaces. I do think that it was like a fear of rocking the boat. Like, I completely get that. But I think to say that there was a commitment to upholding the status quo is a disservice to anyone in there. Sometimes people are just shy. Sometimes people are afraid of the consequences. Like, just because you're very comfortable being loud and boisterous and pushing back, not everyone is. You don't know. Honestly, for these movements that try to say we honor and recognize the struggles of others, when that person you don't perceive as in your group, you tend to be very critical of them and not understanding that it may not be a commitment to the status quo, it may be a fear of punishment for challenging the status quo. Like, if we're gonna go there, let's fucking go there. An incredible amount of energy was spent trying to make sure that everyone was nice and non-threatening. Conversations about accountability were quickly discarded as petty manifestations of rudeness. Discussions about history and political ideology were cast as terrifyingly intellectual. That almost seems like she's calling them stupid. And for the first time, there were women who were vociferously defending diets and weight loss. Yes, because some people genuinely do want to lose weight. They do. And I don't know if it's that they're defending the diets and weight loss, or if they're defending themselves against your perceived judgment, or they're perceived that you're judging them, which you are, clearly. So, because they eschewed hard conversations, it was impossible to be real with them. It's important to be clear that this performance of white femininity and white gentility is just that, a performance. As starched and polished and pearl bedecked as that performance is, at its core is the notion of submission and the idea that through submission we can maintain privilege. Third, the movement's vision felt much, much smaller. As I went from organizing primarily with queer people to organizing primarily with straight cis women, I was shocked to find that the scope of vision shifted drastically from a clear articulated desire for human rights to an implied desire to primarily access privilege. The queers I had met in fat activism were proudly politicized, having spent years and sometimes decades learning about oppression and being unabashed in their pursuit of justice. The straight women I began to meet were more politically demure. They were preoccupied with the avoidance of being considered mean and had a strong distaste for other women they perceived as hostile in their political stances. They wanted a movement that was nice and supportive, not emotionally nuanced or accountability driven. Here's the thing, I think, especially with this 10 years ago, but as we've seen kind of gaining traction, people with their political ideologies have become a bit more hostile. And if you're, like, in your face, this is what it like, if you're in your face about it, you do come across as hostile, number one, which means that you're probably not as open to discussion. We've seen this with the Fed activists already. They come out with these broad claims. They are hostile in that they will make personal attacks, and then when you counter their argument ignoring the personal attacks, then they cry victim, and that you are, in the case of Fat Sapphic Bro, harassing a multiply marginalized person. The difference is that you were likely in an echo chamber before. These people definitely probably grew up with the sense of talking about politics was a little distasteful, so there is that tightrope that they're walking in, trying to make it address the issues but also not rocking the boat. I don't know. This is one where it's like you're not seeing the other person's side, and there's actually two sides to this. They seem to want primarily clothing they liked, more substantive access to heterosexual romance, and the right to claim that they were radical no matter their actual politics. Isn't that what they're doing now, though? Isn't that what Virgie was doing? Wait. Like, you guys talk about not having access to cute clothes. You guys talk about how if you don't find fat women attractive, you're fat phobic. Even Virgie has said that eating donuts in public is a radical act. Isn't that you saying that anything that you do is radical no matter what your actual politics are? The lack of self-awareness. What? Clothing and romance had always been really important parts of and conversations within fat activism for sure, but the political demands and expectations didn't begin and end there. I found that in organizing with other straight women, their expectations had a dangerously low ceiling. So what other things are you talking about? I mean, I've heard about medical fat phobia, so like that was like, and there have been times when it's like, no, that's actually, there's a bit of validity there that's unfortunately just crowded with bullshit. What do you... Interesting. Sadly, I found that at the core of their indifference toward freedom or liberation was their proximity to men. Some part of them knew that their relationship to men would shift if they could admit the truth, that men played a large role in maintaining their subjugated status. I wish I could say that they were scared that once they admitted the truth and sought accountability, that their desire to be close to their current or potential partner would change. But the truth was that they were scared that if they spoke the truth, that men wouldn't want to be with them. They would have become those difficult women they had disliked previously. They were still taking care of men. For many, they were taking care of men they hadn't even met yet, men they hoped to meet in the future. Virgie is, like, clearly very judgmental of the cis white women, and she is so not seeing the parallels that we see in the fat activist community today. Like, how is this, like, she talked so vaguely about the spaces that she had with queer people, and so specifically about the spaces that she had with cis white women, that I can't help but wonder how different were the spaces actually, because you talk about it vaguely. Is it just a sense that you got? Did you feel like maybe you were just rejected from them because you're not white? Because that's a completely valid claim. But to say that just in general they were this only interested in preserving their privilege, I think, and treating them as this hive mind, essentially, does no real service to your overall argument. Straightness has long kept women from organizing and from demanding not only what is ours, but also what is right and just. Straightness? Straightness has done that? What? Are you sure that's just not, like, the pushing of old-fashioned gender roles of what a good woman should be, and maybe that's internalized? I mean, you can make an argument. That's the thing with these social justice ideologies and rhetoric, is that you can kind of make the same point. You can make, not the same point, but opposite points with the same group of people depending on which lens you're looking through. It is both our fear and our investment that holds us hostage. I honestly don't know exactly how to reconcile the imagined future spent with a dude by my side and the reality that I know an anti-assimilationist queer politic is the one that inspires the deepest and has the realest resonance for me. Didn't she marry a man though? But I do know that freedom is the only way, and any movement that does not center collective liberation is not one in which I can invest. She really seems to be demonizing. She consistently demonizes men, just across the board. She demonizes men, and now she's moved on to white cis women as well, despite the fact that she is a cis woman herself. But we'll put that aside. And this is kind of the problem with a lot of social justice spaces, is that there's this demonization, just as, don't get me wrong, a lot of these marginalized people are systemically oppressed, and I recognize that, but I don't think that any service is done by demonizing those in the majority. I don't think that that helps anyone, but that's my perspective. This went on for a while. Quick notes: maintain my weight again this week. I have been reading a lot of manga. I fucking have continued on with A Man and His Cat, and it's so fucking cute, and I love it. And then there's also I'm the Cat Lord's Manservant, which is fucking hilarious. I love it because it's a bunch of Bakeneko which are like these cat demons that live in this big house that this guy's father, who just died, had bought for them, and it was like his secret. He went there, they didn't like trust him at first, and they've been kind of warming up to him. And what's really hilarious is they transform as humans and then as cats and then as humans, and they kind of go back and forth. And seeing the different personalities that you would definitely see in cats as humans is also really funny, especially when they're talking about where's my catnip in their human form. It's really entertaining, and I love it. I'm making more progress with Snow White with the red hair. We're seeing Shirayuki kind of gaining some status in the palace, which I'm loving. Still within the first season of Noragami as I'm going through the manga, so I don't have much to say there, except that Yukine was portrayed very charitably in the anime. He's so much more of a little asshole in the manga, but Yato is also a bit more sympathetic than he is in the anime, because we get a better look at what he's continually suffering. We get a better overall look at his general views and why he has issues with certain things, and so he's a bit more of a sympathetic character, which I'm liking. I definitely think the Noragami manga is better than the anime, but I would recommend watching the anime first if you like the concept and you at least like the characters somewhat. Then it's worth reading the manga. That is where I'm going to leave it today. Don't think I have anything else to add. Sorry I went off on a few tangents, long-ass tangents today. I might have cut some of them because it was just, I was having a hard time getting a focused output of what I was actually thinking. But I'm going to leave it for today. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.